we are going to learn a process called completing the square. It's going to help us to solve what's called a quadratic equation. We've already graphed quadratic functions, which are parabolas. So we have been working on solving quadratic equations. So completing the square is a process that allows us to solve a quadratic equation. Completing the square is a process that allows you to write an expression in the form ax squared plus bx as the square of a binomial. So for example, x squared plus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial because when we factor x squared plus 6x plus 9, we get x plus 3 times x plus 3, which can also be written as x plus 3 squared. So that's what we're going to work on first, is learning how to make a perfect square trinomial. So the next two examples are helping us to do that. Find the value of c that makes x squared minus 4x plus c a perfect square trinomial. Then write the expression as the square of a binomial, just like we did to the right. So the way that we complete the square is for x squared plus bx plus c. So for x squared plus bx plus c, it's going to be b divided by 2 and then squared. This is how we complete the square. I'm going to go ahead and make a big circle around that because the way that we complete the square is we take whatever the b is, we divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it. So for x squared minus 4x plus c, the b in this case is negative 4. So the b is negative 4. So I'm going to do negative 4 divided by 2, and then I'm going to square it. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared is 4. So the c that makes a perfect square trinomial for x squared minus 4x plus c is positive 4. So we're going to write x squared minus 4x plus 4, and then we're going to factor it. We're going to write it as the square of a binomial by factoring it. So x squared minus 4x plus 4 is the same thing as x minus 2 times x minus 2. So we're going to write it as x minus 2 squared. So the c is 4, and the square of the binomial is x minus 2 squared. Let's do that again. Find the value of c that makes x squared plus 10x plus c a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so the b in this example is 10. So I'm going to do 10 divided by 2, and then I'm going to square it. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So the c that makes a perfect square would be 25. So that means my trinomial is x squared plus 10x plus 25. So I can factor it, and when I factor it, I get x plus 5 times x plus 5, which we can write it as x plus 5 squared. Okay, so knowing how to complete the square is going to help us to solve a quadratic equation that I cannot factor. We've spent some time factoring quadratic equations and solving them by using factoring. But completing the square is for equations that we cannot factor. So I'm going to show you the process, and we're going to do 4 of them together. Okay, so the very first steps, I'm going to start with letter A. X squared plus 10x minus 3 is equal to 0. First step is always to add the number, the constant, the number over to the other side. So I'm going to leave a space and move the 3 to the other side. The second step is to complete the square. So I'm going to do b divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. That's the next step. So in this example, the b is 10, isn't it? So I'm going to do 10 divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. So that would be 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So I'm going to, let's change our color so we'll see what we do. I'm going to add 25 to both sides. It's an equation, so whatever I do to one side, I have to do the same thing to the other side. Okay, let's keep going. We've got x squared plus 10x plus 25, which I can factor. So I'm going to factor it next. And it's going to be x plus 5 times x plus 5, which is, we're going to write it just like we did from the examples above, x plus 5 squared equals, and on the other side, I have 3 plus 25, which is 28. Okay, the next step, so we did two steps so far. We added the 3 to the other side, then we completed the square. After you complete the square, you're going to take the square root of both sides. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of anything squared is itself. So the square root of x plus 5 squared is just x plus 5. And so I put, since I took the square root, I'm going to put a plus or minus. And I need to simplify the square root of 28. So I'm going to do a factor tree. Factor tree would be 7 times 4, 2 times 2. So I can take out a 2. So I have a pair of 2's. It's going to be 2 times the square root of 7. And then the last thing I have to do after I simplify that square root is to get x by itself. So I have to subtract 5 from both sides. So I get x equals, I'm going to write the answer at the top up here, negative 5 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 7. Put the negative 5 in front of the plus or minus, always. All right, let's do it again. All right, so this example looks very similar. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 8 to both sides. So I get x squared plus 6x, leave a space, equals 8. Move the 8 to the other side. Leave a space because the next step is to complete the square. So I'm going to take b, the b is 6, I'm going to divide it by 2, and then I'm going to square it. So I'm going to do 6 divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Don't forget to add it to both sides. Whatever you do to one side, you do the same thing to the other side. So I add 9 to both sides because that gives me a perfect square. So the next thing I want to do is I want to factor this trinomial. That's going to be x plus 3 and x plus 3. And on the other side, I have 8 plus 9, which is 17. So I'm going to write x plus 3 times x plus 3 as x plus 3 squared. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to have that squared so I can take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x plus 3 squared, remember the square root of anything squared is itself. So we're going to cross out the square root and the squared. And I'm going to put a plus or minus on the other side right away. Don't forget that. And then I'm going to do a factor tree to see if I can simplify 17. And I cannot. So I'm just going to write square root of 17. And then the last step is to get x by itself. So if it says x plus 3, I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So my answer is negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 17. Okay, so I just did 2 exactly the same way. Let's try the next one. We've got a couple more to do. Okay, so the thing about numbers, letter C, the problem with letter C is it doesn't say x squared, it says 3x squared. So we have to get rid of that 3 in order to complete the square. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything by 3. So we're going to divide everything by 3. So let's see, I get x squared minus 6 divided by 3 is 2, so 2x plus 12 divided by 3 is 4. Okay, now we're ready to solve the equation. So the first step is to subtract 4 from both sides. We're going to move that 4 to the other side. So x squared minus 2x, leave a space, equals negative 4. Okay, now I'm ready to complete the square. So in this case, the b is negative 2. So I'm going to do negative 2 divided by 2 and then square it. So negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, and negative 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Don't forget to add it to both sides. Okay, and on this side, I'm going to factor this trinomial. That's going to be x minus 1 times x minus 1. And on the other side, negative 4 plus 1 is negative 3. Okay, and then I'm going to write this as a perfect square. X minus 1 squared equals negative 3. And so I can take the square root of both sides. Notice I'm doing the same steps every time. So the square root of x minus 1 squared is just x minus 1. Remember, the square root and the squared cancel each other out. I put a plus or minus on the other side, and then I simplify. We know how to simplify the square root of negative 3. That's going to be I times the square root of 3. And then the last thing, after you simplify your square root and you don't forget your plus or minus, is to get x by itself. So if it says x minus 1, we're going to add 1 to the other side. So we get x equals 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 3. Okay, so I've done the same steps all 3 times. Let's do it one more time and you can see that the steps never change. First thing I want to do is I want to add 12 to both sides. Move the 12 over to the other side. It says minus 12, so I'm going to add 12. Okay, and then I'm going to complete the square. So I need to do 4 divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. So when I do 4 divided by 2, I get 2, and 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Don't forget to add it to both sides. On this side, I'm going to factor my trinomial. That's going to be x plus 2 times x plus 2. It's always going to be the same. It's a perfect square, so it's always going to be the same. 12 plus 4 is 16. Okay, so I'm going to write x plus 2 times x plus 2 as x minus plus 2 squared, so that I can take the square root of both sides. Square root of anything squared is itself. Square root of anything squared is itself. So we just get x plus 2. You got to put your plus or minus. And the square root of 16, I know, is 4. And we're almost finished. The only thing we have left to do is we have to get x by itself. So I have to subtract 2 from both sides. So this one's a little different because 16 is a perfect square. Square root of 16 is not a square root anymore. It's just 4. So you have to tell me what these two numbers are. So let's see. We end up with negative 2 plus or minus 4. So that's negative 2 plus 4 or negative 2 minus 4. So negative 2 plus 4 is 2, and negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6.